We're eating more poultry now. We're not eating more beef. Since 1960, we're eating less beef. We're eating less pork, or about the same amount of pork. We're eating a very small amount of lamb and goat. What we're eating more of is poultry. And I'll talk about why that's a major problem because of the way our poultry is fed today. Our poultry is fed corn, and corn is high in linoleic acid. So by eating chicken, we are actually increasing the vegetable oil in our diet as well. So this increase in meat is really not red meat, as so many would vilify, and it's probably not an increase in saturated fat. It's an increase in poultry, and it's an increase in polyunsaturated fat because poultry is fed corn. Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. What is up, you guys? I am so excited for this week's episode. But before I tell you about that, I want to tell you about my book. You guys know the Carnivore Code. TheCarnivoreCodebook.com is available now for pre-order. You can go to that website, thecarnivorecodebook.com. You can pre-order ebook, print, or audio now. We added the audio to pre-orders, so if you want to get on the first to get it audiobook list from Amazon or Kindle, which I guess are the same thing, or whatever, or Kindle's Barnes & Noble. Anyway, you get the idea. Audible, whatever. You can audiobook, pre-order there, and the print. I appreciate your support so much of this because I am super passionate about correcting the lies. In this week's podcast with Nina, we are talking about correcting the lies that have been foisted upon us for 60 years, that red meat is bad for us, that saturated fat is bad for us, and this is hurting us as a people, as we go into great detail on in this podcast. And the success of my book will change the course of history, I believe. And that's not to be hyperbolic or prideful or conceited. It's just that a book about the carnivore diet challenges so many of the long-held notions of what is healthy. And I think it could improve thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of lives. Getting onto something like the New York Times bestseller list, which is absolutely a goal of mine, and I absolutely believe will happen with the second edition of the book, will change things in a big way and will send a huge message that so many people are getting healthy and sort of questioning the dogma that is probably wrong. As you all know, I'm not saying everyone needs to eat only meat, but I definitely believe that animal foods deserve a place in everyone's diet and are a huge part of what makes us healthy and optimal. And plant foods exist on a spectrum of toxicity. So those are the tenets of a carnivore diet, as you know. So check out my book, thecarnivorecodebook.com. Thank you for your support with pre-orders now. I'm going to be releasing a special video for those people that pre-order. So if you pre-order now, I'll send you, I'll have a link very soon and you can put in your order number and you will get a special video that I recorded today. It's 20 minutes long. It's my explanation of the 5 tiers of a carnivore diet, how to do a carnivore diet in that video. It'll give you lots of great information and it's only available to those who pre-order. I love you all, but if you're pre-ordering my book, I especially love you because that's super awesome support for this movement and for me, and I hope it'll be valuable for you. I'm also going to do an exclusive question and answer for those who pre-order after the release of the book on August the 4th, 2020. So thank you for your support in that way. If you've read the book, I would so appreciate if you would go to Amazon.com and leave me a review. If you like this podcast, please leave me a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to it, because that helps me reach more people when they know that this podcast is valuable or that you find value in it. If you don't like this podcast, send me an email, drpaul@carnivoremd, and let me know what I can do to make it better. Or if you want to see other people on this podcast, you can send me an email there too. So on to this podcast with my friend Nina Teicholz. A Big Fat Surprise is an incredible book. It's just a detective story. It's an expose. It was a New York Times bestseller in 2014. It's definitely worth your time. We get into a lot of the studies in this podcast. We definitely get technical. And at the very end of the podcast, I go on a little monologue after Nina has to go about my newest fascination regarding saturated fats and insulin resistance, really the molecular mechanisms of insulin resistance. I posted a video about this on Instagram and YouTube. If you want more information, I'm going to be talking about it a lot in the future. If it's a little too technical, don't stress it. The take home is that polyunsaturated vegetable oils break your metabolism. Do not eat them, and be very careful about consuming animals that are fed corn and soybeans, which are going to make their fat higher in polyunsaturated vegetable oils, specifically pigs and chickens. May not be a great idea unless they are really, really well raised. It's tricky to find. We're working on it. One of the ways that we are working on it is with my friends at White Oak Pastures. You know these guys, www.whiteoakpastures.com. They are in Bluffton, Georgia. They have been doing regenerative agriculture for 20 plus years now. Will Harris is a visionary. This is the type of agriculture where cows are rotationally grazed, and it is found to be carbon negative. Life cycle analyses show that this type of farming increases the carbon carrying capacity of the soil and increases the organic matter in the soil. That means more rainwater is held, less runoff, less erosion, healthier plants, healthier animals, and then healthier humans that are grateful to be nourished by those animals. White Oak is good people doing good things. Give them a call. You can use the code CarnivoreMD to get 10% off your first order. They are really part of my family now. We're going to be doing an event there October 9th and 10th, I believe, at White Oak Pastures. It's White Oak Cella. Look for more information about that very soon. We'll be doing all kinds of great things. I'll be there. We'll have other folks there talking. You can give me a high five. You can steak dance with me. It'll be an awesome time. I hope to see you guys in Bluffton, Georgia. But check out White Oak Pastures, grass-fed, grass-finished beef and lamb. And I really want to work with them in the future to get low polyunsaturated chicken and pork. Stay tuned for that. I am also super grateful to be connected with the folks at NutriSense. So I hope you will listen to my continuous glucose monitor podcast, nutrisense.io. And that is the website. And I think you can still use the code CarnivoreMD for a little bit of money off a subscription, but a continuous glucose monitor will change the way you eat. If you see your postprandial glucose spiking, or you see postprandial patterns of glucose that are not healthy, and I talk about all of that in the previous CGM podcast, which you can find here or on YouTube or wherever, then it helps you understand that, hey, these foods are not healthy. One of the great things about this is that my dad has agreed to wear a continuous glucose monitor. He's an internist, he's a doctor, he's a role model for me, but he's working on changing his own diet too. And so he is going to wear a CGM, and I will be talking about his CGM results in the very near future and how it worked for him to create some sense of how his insulin sensitivity was, looking at his glucose in real time, and if it helped him make behavioral change for the positive. I love my father deeply, and I want him around for a long time, and I want him to live well. And so getting him a CGM is something that I think is really cool, and I'm really excited that he's willing to do this experiment for me and then potentially share it all with you. Maybe if I'm super lucky, I will get my father on this podcast. We'll see. But check out nutrisense.io and think about getting a continuous glucose monitor. It will really change the way you look at the foods you're eating. And check out that CGM episode. So please check out my book, thecarnivorecodebook.com, whiteoakpastures.com, nutrisense.io, and leave me a review on Amazon if you've read my book, and leave this podcast a review. Thank you so much for all of that. You can sign up for my newsletter at carnivoremd.com, which is where most of my stuff is. You can even see videos there about what I eat in a day and how I work out. They're on the About page where you can learn more about me. And in the next few weeks, stay tuned, you guys, for super exciting launch of sort of the passion project that I've been working on in Austin. Really the reason I moved to Texas. It'll be coming in the next few weeks. So stay tuned, stay excited. And it is a very exciting way to get nose to tail nutrition in a very convenient form. So that is exciting. And in the process, we will be supporting regenerative farms because we will be sourcing these organs from regenerative farms. So all the stuff I care about, I'm going to announce it all very soon in the next few weeks. I can't wait to tell you about it. On to the podcast with Nina Teicholz. Check out her book, A Big Fat Surprise, and listen afterwards podcast for what is going on with me. I love you all. Talk to you in a bit. All right. Nina Teicholz, I'm so excited. Thank you for coming on my podcast. It's been a long time coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be talking to you.
I think this is going to be an amazing show. So people who are listening should buckle up, buckle your seatbelts, get your earplugs in, get your earbuds in, because we've got so much to cover. But I think that the idea here, this feels to me, before we got on the podcast, I said to you, this is important. This topic that we're going to talk about today, the demonization of saturated fat, and if it's really warranted, and then simultaneously, the elevation, the praising of polyunsaturated fat that's happening in our culture over the last 70 years, this story that you've so compellingly and in such detail told in A Big Fat Surprise is so important. And I think it becomes more important every day. And I'm so excited that I can have you here to kind of tell this story with me, because so many people continue to be misled here. It's just crazy.
Well, you're speaking to the converted. I obviously think it's a super important story because, if you think about there the three great mistakes in nutrition that have been made, you're right, in the last 70 years. So they're like cholesterol, that dietary cholesterol is bad for you. We've kind of gotten over that. There are no more formal caps on cholesterol anymore. And then there was the low-fat diet, just reduced fat overall. That's been around for maybe 60 years. And we've kind of gotten past that. There's no more low-fat diet recommendations. But the one that will not yield is perhaps, as you say, the most damaging. This idea that you should replace saturated fats in healthy, normal foods like dairy and meat and eggs, replace that with industrial product called polyunsaturated vegetable oils, which are, these highly industrial products that are, I believe, toxic to your health. That idea will not die. And it is truly amazing how it just hangs on by the slenderest threads. So I'm always happy to talk about it. For some reason, it never bores me. It should, but it doesn't.
I think it's at the center of our dietary crisis, and we're going to talk about this. But if we set the stage, I think most people listening to this podcast will realize that we are freaking unhealthy as a country and even as a world. But let's just talk about the United States. Our obesity rates are skyrocketing. People will have heard me talk about this paper that I've quoted many times, suggesting that only 12% of the United States population actually meets criteria for metabolic health. And that's based on 12% of the people not having one of the 5 criteria for metabolic syndrome. That's a paper I reference in my book, and I think you reference in your book as well. And you can even look at the CDC and other widely accepted data hubs, and they will all admit that 70 to 80% plus of our population is obese or overweight. And yet no one is really raising alarm and saying, why the heck are we so sick? And so this is a very important question in kind of the beginning of our story. We're not a healthy people.
Right. So anybody who wants to look up that paper, just look up University of North Carolina, 88% or 12%, and you'll find that paper. It's based on government data called NHANES data. The CDC estimate is that 60% of Americans have one or more diet-related chronic disease, and then the percentage of people who have obesity as of February of this year of adults is 42% obese, not overweight and obese, which, as you said, is about 2/3 of the nation. 42% are obese. And if you go into minority communities like, Hispanic or African-American communities, those numbers are higher. So it really is, and to put it in the context of this, this coronavirus moment in which we're all living, in which we have been horrified by the numbers of deaths, surpassing 100,000 in just, under 6 months. The number of people who, according to the CDC, the government, the number of people who die every year from diet-related chronic disease is 1.8 million. So that's the top 10, that's cancer, chronic pulmonary disease, diabetes, obesity, and, all these 1.8 million. And why don't we talk about it? I think we don't talk about it because we don't have any answers, or our experts have no answers. They have no more ideas. They're like, well, how about an app to track your calories and put this just came out of the Dietary Guideline Committee last week. We need an app, and we need to start with children putting in everything they're eating because that's likely to create eating disorders in people. No, there are just no ideas about what else to do. There was the idea of counting calories. There was the idea of cutting fat, but they didn't work. And now we're out of ideas. So it's like, well, off the table.
And I think
we're not
people are
talking about it.
Yeah, I think people are not willing to admit that they didn't work. And so we're doing everything right. And why are people dying? And why are there so many people who are so sick? People are just not eating less and moving more. That's the solution. We just need to get people to eat less. It's all portion control. And it's like, no, 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 no. There's something much more nuanced and sinister going on here. So I just want to screen share a few things here that are some of the statistics that we're talking about. This is from a post from Jeff Nobbs. This is actually a fantastic post that we'll link to in the show notes, What Causes Chronic Disease. I think this is a great framework for the beginning of our conversation, and we will refer back to it frequently. This graph only goes back to the 1970s, and you can see that the obesity rates in America are absolutely skyrocketing, absolutely skyrocketing. And this is obesity, you guys. Now, obesity is just formal definition based on a BMI, but if we include overweight, as both Nina and I are saying, overweight and obese is up to 70% of this country. That is staggering. And even more staggering, and this is what we're going to be talking about as well in this podcast, is the percentage of the population with chronic disease. 60% of our population has chronic disease, and it's just going up and up and up from, this one goes back to the 1930s. And we can talk about this history in here is really the subject of Nina's amazing book. And this is what we're really going to get into in the podcast. Like, what the heck is going on here with this chronic disease epidemic? Let's just start with the notion there's a pandemic beyond the coronavirus pandemic. I'm not discounting the fact this virus is killing people, but there's a deeper pandemic here. And I mean, you wrote this article in the Wall Street Journal, which I was so appreciative of. So thank you for fighting. Thank you for fighting the good fight here. And of course, it's the Wall Street Journal, so I don't have a subscription. They won't let me show the real story. But Nina's article is a low-carb strategy for fighting the pandemic's toll. We're going to talk about why reducing carbohydrates could lead to improvements in obesity, diabetes, heart disease. And these are the things that are driving the pandemic. But as anyone who listens to my podcast knows, that's not what the mainstream media is ever going to talk about. So I want to start here, Nina, because you tweeted this the other day. Thank you, Andrew Jacobs, New York Times, for a great New York Times piece about problems in the process behind our dietary guidelines. Lack of rigorous science, many corporate conflicts of interest on the expert panel, no verified methodology, and exclusion of disadvantaged groups. So we can maybe put a link to this tweet and the New York Times article in the show notes. But before this podcast, you and I have had a lot of conversations about what's going on now with these guidelines. So let's just bring the listeners up to speed about what's going on with the nutritional guidelines, and then talk about the very recently, in the last 72 hours, paper published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, which has some striking conclusions. So what is going on right now?
Okay, I feel like I should be taking notes to cover all your points. Let's start with the guidelines, and I want to tie it back to those graphs that you showed of obesity and chronic disease in America, because there were some data points, and it looks like it's just a straight, the line goes up and up and up. But if you had more data points in there, you realize that obesity was down around 11% for quite a while. But it's 1980 that it tips upwards and then starts its rapid ascent. What happened in 1980 was the introduction of the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which was a national nutrition policy for all Americans. Now, that's correlation. It's not causation. It is not causation. But it's really important to know that these guidelines, how incredibly influential they are. Just briefly, I mean, they determine things like, all the feeding assistance programs, feeding programs for the elderly, those Meals on Wheels, school lunches and school breakfasts for the most disadvantaged among us, all the food that goes to Native American populations, the people on food stamp, which is now called SNAP. I mean, their education is all about the dietary guidelines. Military bases, they're told to eat the food according to the guidelines. Any institution that receives federal funding is eating according to the guidelines in their cafeterias and in their programs. And all dietitians and all doctors are largely instructed to teach the guidelines. It's not that they cannot. In some cases, actually, I've heard that they can't. Like in a large medical practice, they're told, you can only teach the gold standard guidelines, and anything else, we risk medical malpractice, so please do not. Or they'll be called in front of their, their medical review board or something. So there's a lot of pressure to teach this way. Plus K through 12 education is all in the guidelines. I will never forget the day my child brought back from kindergarten his little Unilever, which is a company that makes a massive multinational that makes vegetable oils. It's a Unilever published book from his kindergarten class saying, like, how to make vegetable oils a part of your healthy diet.
Oh my God.
Co-sponsored with the USDA. So it's so pervasive, these guidelines. And, all cattle has been bred to be leaner. The reason your pork is tasteless is that all animals were bred to be leaner. So the effect is really pervasive throughout society, and they've had this massive impact, and they control food, especially for people who have no other option, the most disadvantaged people. It disadvantages them because, and this is the shocker, the guidelines are only for healthy people. So they only do prevention. They don't do what's called treatment. So they don't even look at the science on people who are diagnosed with obesity, diabetes, heart disease. They don't look at that science. So theoretically, they're only for that 12%. They're only about prevention. I mean, we could argue if they self-evidently have not done prevention either, because they haven't been able to combat any of these diet-related diseases. But it's really extraordinary how, they've been completely ineffective, and they have arguably caused the obesity and diabetes epidemics. You could make that case, I believe, because what they did was they told Americans who in 1965 were eating under 40% of our calories as carbohydrates, they told everybody to eat over 50% of your calories as carbohydrates, mainly grains. And even though they say whole grains, if you look at their actual formularies, what kids are actually getting in school, like why kids are having donuts for breakfast, it's that half the grains are actually refined grains. So telling everybody to reduce their fat, increase their carbohydrates is, we don't know if that causes obesity, but what we do know from many, many randomized controlled clinical trials, I mean, I'm talking like, 100 clinical trials on thousands of people, we know that if you reduce your carbohydrates and increase your fats, then you will be able to start reversing those diseases. So it stands to reason, although it may not be necessarily true, but it stands to reason that then doing the opposite of that would increase your likelihood of getting those diseases. So that's what the guidelines did. They increased our carbohydrates and reduced our fat. And they told us to, which is I think what you wanted to get to, which is they told us instead of saturated fats to eat polyunsaturated vegetable oils, which meant effectively, and also to reduce cholesterol. So effectively that meant reducing animal foods, less meat, less dairy, fewer eggs, only the egg whites. If, for many, many years, it was only egg whites, no shellfish because I had cholesterol. And if you do eat meat or dairy, it has to be lean, low fat, or non-fat. And, this paper that just came out in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology is highly significant for a number of reasons. Okay, first of all, that's a very conservative organization made up of cardiologists. They hate saturated fats because saturated fats tend to raise your LDL. And they have been taught above all is to treat LDL because statins treat LDL. And they have a drug to treat LDL, and so they feel like the diet must follow the drug. And that's like, but it seems logical, and I don't blame them for thinking that's logical, but the reality is that in diet trials where they've lowered LDL, they have never been able to find reductions in cardiovascular events or cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. So diet just does not work in the same way that drugs work. Statins work in their own way. Diet does not mimic that, and you cannot make that assumption. But this study, which is it's significant because it reviews all the evidence on saturated fats. It's not the first time that's been done. There are nearly 20 other review papers of the data on saturated fats, all of which conclude that saturated fats, or almost all of which conclude that saturated fats have no effect on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. But this paper not only does that, but it is unique in that the authors are very prominent scientists. They're what those of us would call on the outskirts of this field, mainstream scientists at mainstream institutions, and they include somebody who was on the Dietary Guideline Committee in 2015 and was on the panel that reviewed the subcommittee that reviewed saturated fats, saying that the evidence against saturated fats was strong. And it includes the 2005 chair of the Dietary Guideline Committee. So that may not seem important, but I mean, these are basically the people at the apex of government policy who'd been appointed to these top committees saying, we now think we got it wrong. And that is very significant because it's very different than you or me saying we got it wrong. Whatever we believe, we don't believe anymore. I mean, we're not, illustrious experts in the field, but these people are. And so this paper is quite extraordinary and I have to disclose that my group, the Nutrition Coalition, sponsored the meeting that allowed these scientists to come together in February of this year. And we didn't decide who was invited and we didn't decide who, what was talked about or anything, but we just wanted these people to come together. We wanted a meeting to happen because it had never happened before. So, and out of that, they decided to do this paper, which is fantastic.
It's really incredible, and I'll share it. I shared it here on the screen, Saturated Fats and Health, a reassessment and proposal for food-based recommendations. And again, this is from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. There are few journals that are more prestigious than this in cardiology. And I'll read the abstract. I would encourage anyone with an interest here to read the whole paper. The recommendation to limit dietary saturated fat intake has persisted, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Most recent meta-analyses, which is a study of studies, a collection of studies, and randomized trials, which are interventional trials, and observational studies, which are the things that I have referred to as epidemiology, found no beneficial effects of reducing saturated fat intake on cardiovascular disease and total mortality, and instead found protective effects against stroke. They go on here. There's a little bit of cognitive dissonance in these authors, and I think this is really interesting. Although saturated fatty acids increase low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, in most individuals, this is not due to increasing levels of small, dense LDL particles, but rather larger LDL, which are much less strongly related to CVD risk. Anyone who's read my book, The Carnivore Code, will know that I am a strong advocate for interpreting LDL in the context of insulin sensitivity. And I have real issue with all of this continued focus on LDL as the main driver of atherosclerosis, independent of insulin sensitivity context. And I've talked about that on multiple podcasts. If people want to listen to previous podcasts on cholesterol and statins, I would recommend the one with Malcolm Kendrick. I've also done a podcast with Ivor Cummins on cholesterol. I've done 2 podcasts with Dave Feldman on cholesterol. I recently did a podcast with a cardiologist named Dr. Jack Wolfson on cholesterol. And I've interviewed a cardiologist in Houston named Nadir Ali on cholesterol. So if people are interested in the cholesterol rabbit hole, and the fact that simply interpreting LDL in a vacuum is as not a great predictor of cardiovascular risk, they can listen to all of those podcasts. There's tons there. But what the group here is saying is that, hey, even if LDL goes up, it doesn't look to be an atherogenic type of LDL. They go on in the abstract to say it is also apparent that the health effects of foods cannot be predicted by their content in any nutrient group without considering the overall macronutrient distribution. Whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, eggs, dark chocolate are saturated fat rich foods with a complex matrix that are not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. You ready for the kicker? The final line in the abstract. The totality of available evidence does not support further limiting the intake of such foods. So again, the paper goes on. It reviews many of the studies, some of which Nina and I are going to talk about today. And again, in the paper, the authors do exhibit some cognitive dissonance, not really understanding how to reconcile the fact that saturated fat may raise LDL with the fact that it doesn't seem to cause cardiovascular disease. Anyone who's read my work will know that those two are not mutually exclusive. But I thought this was an interesting place to start because I want to take it, that's where we are today, right? This preeminent committee is saying saturated fat's not a big deal. But the guidelines from the government are still going to be to limit saturated fat. Hopefully not, but they may end up being that way. And if we ask 9 out of 10 people on the street, is saturated fat bad for you? They're still going to say yes. And so this is all coming. This is the story that you tell in your book, A Big Fat Surprise. How the heck did we get this ingrained false notion in our minds? So I want to go back in time. I want to get in the DeLorean with you and go back to the future, right? And we're going to go back to the 1950s and talk about Eisenhower and Ansel Keys and walk people through how we got to this crazy place where everyone is so misled. Before we do that, I want to show, I had to do this. So I heard you talk about this on another podcast. And if you guys are not watching this on YouTube, then you may want to watch this part on YouTube because this is amazing. So I love that you pointed out that in the 1970s, people were not that obese, and that obesity rates really started rising in the 1980s with the introduction of these low-fat guidelines. And I was a young tyke in the 1980s. But you pointed something out, that if we look at pictures of people waiting in line for Star Wars in 1977, and this is my favorite one with this Darth Vader guy right here, no one is obese, right? And you can see the same thing if you look at people at French airports in 1977. And I mean, I just love looking at people waiting in line for Star Wars in 1977 because this is one of my favorite movies ever. But really, this is a very different collection of people than we might see today. And it's an illustration of the fact that the obesity rates were staggeringly lower in 1977. And this is great, right? Han Solo, and it's like, anyway, iconic stuff. I had to show that. But what the heck has happened? So that's the 1970 to 1980 problem. But let's go back a little further and start this story and just really show people how the heck did we get here? Because you're so good at telling the story. You tell it in such detail in your book. Let's take it back to like the 1900s. I mean, there really was no heart disease before 1950s, right? I've heard you talk about this. It was really Eisenhower's heart attack that sort of sparked this revolution.
Yeah. Well, many of your listeners will have heard this story, so I will maybe keep it relatively brief. But the early 1900s there was almost no heart disease, and people will often say, well, they didn't know how to diagnose it. But in fact, it had been diagnosed and written of in detail, including in medical textbooks by the mid-19th century. It was very, very rare, but it was understood. But the hospitals just were not seeing cases. There are famous medical accounts of this in the 20s and 30s where there's just a tiny handful of people coming in with heart disease. During the 1920s, the late 1920s, there was they started to see at the end of the 1920s like a really quite rapid increase in the number of heart disease cases. That was in part due to the ability to diagnose it through in a different way of diagnosing it. So there's some tricky bits with the statistics, but really by the 1940s and 50s, you have heart disease has risen to be the number one killer, and I think it's one of these things one has to really try to imagine, like all of a sudden people like you and me or me, I guess at my age, a little younger, but men are dropping dead in the prime of life. And everybody's fathers had lived to ripe old ages unless they had gone to war. And so this was brand new that young men were just dying in the prime of life. And there were a number of theories about this rising public health emergency, a number of ideas. Like some people thought it was vitamin deficiency, quite a logical hypothesis. Other people thought it was auto exhaust with the rising number of cars that were then coming onto the road. Other people thought it was a type A personality. You run around and scream at everybody, and then all of a sudden you drop dead of a heart attack, and you probably deserve it for being so mean. And then there was this idea by Ansel Keys, who was a physiologist at the University of Minnesota. He had a number of other degrees as well. And he was really focused on this idea that it was cholesterol. And it was cholesterol and saturated fat. It was the diet-heart hypothesis. And that hypothesis held that eating dietary cholesterol in eggs, shellfish, liver, and saturated fat, which was in those foods and also in dairy, they would turn those hard fats would clog your arteries and then fill up your arteries and give you a heart attack. It was quite a visually powerful image, right? It's like putting hot oil down a cold stovepipe, you're like, ooh, and then you die of a heart attack.
It makes sense, right?
Except it totally makes intuitive sense. It's just that, that's not the way biology works. But that was the idea that it wasn't the idea caught fire so much. It was that Ancel Keys, as I try to portray in my book, was this very domineering individual. He was extremely sure of his own ideas. He was willing to bully anybody into an argument, and he just had an unshakable faith in his beliefs. And so he got himself appointed onto the nutrition committee of the American Heart Association. At the time, was really the only group speaking out about heart disease. And in 1960, whereas the American Heart Association was saying, we wish we knew it would cause heart disease, but we really don't think there's any evidence. By 1961, Ancel Keys gets himself onto this small committee, and he convinces all of them to state that it is saturated fat and cholesterol, his hypothesis, that is the cause of heart disease. And this is really the first statement anywhere in the world. 1961, also the same date as that Time magazine cover that you brought up so nicely. That was the first advice anywhere in the world, to limit your intake of meat and dairy in order to avoid and to switch to having polyunsaturated vegetable oils in order to avoid a heart attack. That's where it really all began. And it's really a fascinating story because I think it has parallels with the moment that we're in today, because we are now in a similar moment of public health emergency, just total emergency, and this tremendous urge and desire for answers. And so we are often just jumping the gun with the science, right? Like maybe this treatment, maybe this will work, maybe that one, maybe it's we don't, and they're publishing journal articles without peer review and jumping way ahead of the gun. And it is precisely that situation that was happening in 1960. And so we can understand why they would jump to conclusions and grab onto a hypothesis without proof. And I forgot to mention that the most important kind of focusing event of all this was in 1955, when President Eisenhower himself had a heart attack and was out of the Oval Office for 10 whole days. That would be like 10 days without Trump at the hospital. And everybody's thinking, this is truly, it's a way of, nothing would focus public attention more than having your president be in the hospital with a potentially killer disease. So really it was Ancel Keys who stepped into that vacuum of the lack of knowledge with his idea and won out. And that has been, he's easily the most influential nutrition scientist of the last three generations. And his ideas have persisted. And the very short capsule answer of why they have persisted, despite being tested and not being found to be true, is that what grew up around his ideas was this huge food pharmaceutical establishment and a bureaucratic establishment that embraced and endorsed him. And the media endorsed him. And so, it's become impossible to back out of this hypothesis, because there has been she's just rigidified into this giant establishment that cannot give up. They cannot give up their profits. They cannot give up their professional investments. They cannot say they're wrong.
These ideas have become calcified into our consciousness. And as you say, they really permeate much deeper than medicine. They go socio-political, agribusiness, multinational. It's a scary thing, and they will not go away. In that Journal of the American College of Cardiology abstract, they say, despite lots of evidence to the contrary, people still say saturated fat is bad. And this is 2020. And so This is exactly the thing. And even as I want to talk about with you, even in the 1970s and 80s, we knew that this theory was really a load of hogwash, but it wasn't talked about. One point that I want to make is, let's go back even further, because I think you drew a very important timeline there for us. In 1900-ish, neither of us was alive, unless you look really good for being 120.
Thanks, my face cream.
Right? Lots of meat. This is what lots of meat does, right? So there were essentially no heart attacks. And then something happened in the early 1900s, and that was Crisco, right? when did vegetable oil become a part of the American consciousness? When did vegetable oil actually get introduced into the American system of
Yeah.
right?
Okay, so I want to say that I don't think we're in a position to say that vegetable oils has caused the heart disease crisis in America, but I do believe there are traces of evidence that suggest it is a contributing cause, because there is a competing hypothesis that has to do with increases in sugar and carbohydrates coming in at about the same time. So, but with that said, the food substance that has increased most in the last 100 years in our diets is vegetable oils. And they were non-existent in the diet. They were used as lubricants for industrial machinery. When they hunted out all the whale population, they didn't have any more. Whales were mainly hunted for oil. And when the whales were gone, they had to start finding other sources of oil for their industrial revolution. And they found cottonseed oil. And then, so cottonseed was really the first oil. It was used for industrial purposes. And then in the early 1900s, Procter and Gamble, I forget the exact history of this, but one was a soap maker and the other was a candle maker. And they discovered that if they took that oil and hardened it, and then bleached it, it looked white like lard, and that they could perhaps sell it to the American public as a lard substitute, because before that time, the only cooking oils that were really used in the West were butter and lard. And so they thought they could supplant lard, and they did that. They named it Crisco, and it came onto the American market in 1911. And that was the beginning of vegetable oils as a human comestible in America. And they had a brilliant marketing campaign because America is a country of immigrants, right? I mean, and so we're so susceptible to advertising. We don't have our grandmother there saying, don't use that newfangled stuff. You have to, use my recipe. So we're uniquely kind of susceptible to, we want to be modern, and Crisco took advantage of that. This is so great to see this. Crisco took advantage of that by saying, put away the ways of your grandmother, and just like the old spinning wheel, you no longer have to use lard and suffer the smells in the kitchen, but this new food substance called Crisco, and it comes from clean industrial labs with clean surfaces, and has none of the ugly smells and dirtiness that's associated with lard and the slaughterhouses. And so it was an incredibly successful campaign. They had cookbooks that were promoting Crisco, and I think one really truly notable event in the history of Procter and Gamble is that they were lucky or very wise or both, and they invested in a very small group at the time called the American Heart Association, which was just beginning because heart disease was rare, so there weren't that many cardiologists in the late 1920s or late 30s. But in 1948, they designated the American Heart Association as the recipient of their famous Walking Man radio contest, and as and overnight they had millions of dollars to give to the American Heart Association as a result of this, as the benefits from this radio show. And they became one of the American Heart. They really launched the American Heart Association. According to the American Heart Association's own company history, they said, that they had an event, they got a big magnified check from Procter and Gamble, and they were able to open multiple offices all over the country and spread their brand everywhere. And they said that was really their launch as a professional association, all due to Procter and Gamble. And of course, not too long after that, they were recommending polyunsaturated vegetable oils to replace saturated fats in order to prevent heart attacks.
Mm-hmm. So I love this. I just want to show, I showed this a moment ago. Crisco 1911, new products, first ever shortening made entirely of vegetable oil was born, clad in pristine white paper overwrap. Crisco was seen as more pure and economical alternative to butter and animal fat. 1940s, AHA, American Heart Association. Crisco made the patriotic switch to glass to help conserve metal during World War II. Look, it's been a part of our consciousness. 1980s, Crisco beats butter with a stick, butter flavor Crisco. And then 2002 to present, this is where it's most scary. many people may not know that these type of vegetables are pervasive in our food supply. All these breads, peanut butters, bad news. And they'll say, no trans fat, but there still are some major problems here. And just to back up for a moment so that everyone knows what we are talking about here, I want to show saturated versus unsaturated fats. Many of my listeners will be aware of this. Saturated fats are a long chain of carbons with no double bonds between the carbons. You have lauric, myristic, palmitic, and stearic. We're going to talk about palmitic and stearic toward the end of this podcast. They're particularly interesting to me right now. They are C16 and C18, and these are primarily found in animal fats, especially the fat of ruminant animals like cows. The unsaturated fats here are on the right. Oleic acid, many people will be familiar with this one as the major unsaturated fatty acid in olive oil, has one double bond. And it's a double bond at the 9th position from the end of the chain, which makes it an omega-9. Linoleic acid, which is something that we're going to talk about a lot today, is the main polyunsaturated fatty acid that we're talking about in things like Crisco and other vegetable oils, corn, canola, safflower, peanut, soybean. It's an 18 carbon fatty acid with 2 double bonds, which makes it polyunsaturated. Alpha linolenic acid is a C18 that is polyunsaturated, but it's an omega-3 because the first double bond is 3 positions from the end of the carbon chain. There are other ones on here, gamma linolenic acid and others, but I also want to highlight for people that in animal fat from ruminants is something called conjugated linoleic acid, and that is not the same as linoleic acid. So later in this podcast, when you hear us referring to polyunsaturated fatty acid, we are generally referring to linoleic acid, an 18 carbon omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid with 2 double bonds in the molecule. I just want to show that to people because this is the difference between this and an animal fat. And though it's only 2 double bonds, this has a massively powerful effect on human biochemistry. And as Nina is saying, there are many things happening over the last essentially 100 years, and even the last 50 years that correlate with the decline in human health and the rise of chronic disease. The introduction of vegetable oil, I think, is one of the major ones. And of course, the processing of grains and processed sugars. We're going to talk about both of those, but I think it's really hard. I actually think at the end of this podcast, I will talk about something I've been geeking out on the last day or two, showing that those two are very closely connected and that eating polyunsaturated vegetable oils is very damaging in the setting of excess carbohydrates because of insulin. But I just wanted to show that. So let's go. Go ahead.
Can I just make one comment? I think we'll talk about later, but I want people to remember at this moment, having just seen those pictures, which is that all of those, the pictures of the polyunsaturated fats with the double bonds, the thing that is really noticeable, they're squiggly, right? They're not straight lines. And that squiggliness means they can't stack on top of each other neatly. The saturated fats are all straight and they stack on top of each other like this. And that's what makes them hard at room temperature. The squiggly ones can't stack on top of each other neatly, and that's what makes them oils because there's space between them. But the squiggliness is important for another reason, which is those double bonds. Every time you have a double bond, for those of you who know your chemistry, and it's not difficult. That double bond means that, and this is where the idea unsaturated comes from. They're not yet saturated with hydrogens. So that double bond can open up and attach to oxygen. And that's what happens, when your oil goes rancid, it's oxidized, or, when you heat it, it's more likely to open up. That's when you speed up a chemical reaction. That's what you do in the chemistry lab. That is oxidation. And that is, we'll probably talk about that later, but that ability, that kind of urge to split open and oxidize what causes oxidation. And just remember, the reason you take antioxidants, if you put them on your face or you eat them in pills, oxidation is terrible for the human body because it drives inflammation, which is the source of many of the diseases that we talk about.
It's a balanced process, and I'll talk about that a little bit because there's a small amount of oxidation that's necessary and that actually is used at the level of the mitochondria to signal biochemical processes. But one of the things and the takeaway from this podcast is going to be that when we increase the amount of polyunsaturated, especially omega-6 or even omega-3 fatty acids in our diet as humans, we mess up human biochemistry. I talked about this in the previous podcast I did with Kate Shanahan, but
yeah,
I just want to let people know that if you look at human evolution and you look at indigenous hunter-gatherer groups, and in your book, you talk about the observations of Willem Stephenson, George Mann. Willem Stephenson is someone I mentioned in my book, Living with the Inuits. George Mann worked with the Maasai in Africa and saw their health. Many people have looked at indigenous groups throughout the world who eat lots of saturated fat that is not processed. They don't eat any vegetable oil. The Tokelau Islanders, Stefan Lindeberg's study, I'll show that one a little bit later, and seeing that they are extremely healthy with no vascular disease, eating lots of saturated fat. So there's a lot of observational evidence that indigenous groups eating saturated fat don't have a problem. And traditionally, if you look at the hunter-gatherer diet and you look at what humans would have eaten evolutionarily, the amount of polyunsaturated fat in wild animals is very low. It's estimated that evolutionarily in our predecessors, we probably had 2% polyunsaturated fatty acid in our diet, and that right now we're estimating 10 and 20 for some people of their fat is polyunsaturated. And so this is really a key point to remember, that there's been a massive increase in the amount of polyunsaturated fat, this linoleic acid in our diet. And that, I think, is one of the key drivers of metabolic problems for humans. We see this in lab animals too. No lab animal has the same physiology as a human, but you can also see that if you give mice lots of polyunsaturated fat, and I'll talk about these studies later, they get very obese. If you give them saturated fat, specifically stearic acid and palmitic acid, they get very thin. What's going on there? Stay tuned. I'll talk about it at the end of this podcast, but there's a real evolutionary discordance going on here. There's an evolutionary inconsistency in the amount of polyunsaturated vegetable oils that we are eating today. And this is happening because of Crisco in the early 1900s, and then their funding of the AHA, and then Ansel Keys sparking all of this with his research. But I want to show a few more things, and then we can move on to some of the research that Ansel Keys has done and the conflicting research, the actual interventional research that was done looking at saturated fat and polyunsaturated fat in controlled randomized trials. But if we look at this graph, which I think is so telling, and this goes back to 1960, trends in the daily calories from major food groups, it goes to about, I would say, 2017 here at the end. The ones here to notice are meat in the square. So here, meat is in green, going up slightly, but not a whole lot. And I will fractionate the type of meat in a moment. Sugar and sweeteners definitely went up from 1960 to about 1998, and then have been going down a little bit since then. They're definitely up since 1960, though. Grains actually went way up between 1960 and 2000 and have come down a little bit since then, but they're significantly up since 1960. But what is this red line here? This one is massively increased. That is vegetable oils, my friends. That is vegetable oils. So if we actually look at this graph and you see, well, a lot of things went up, but many other things went down, meat is by far the least increase. And if you look at the amount of meat that people are eating, or the type of meat that people are eating, and this may be getting ahead of ourselves with the story, we're eating more poultry now. We're not eating more beef. Since 1960, we're eating less beef. We're eating less pork, or about the same amount of pork. We're eating a very small amount of lamb and goat. What we're eating more of is poultry. And I'll talk about why that's a major problem because of the way our poultry is fed today. Our poultry is fed corn, and corn is high in linoleic acid. So by eating chicken, we are actually increasing the vegetable oil in our diet as well. So this increase in meat is really not red meat, as so many would vilify, and it's probably not an increase in saturated fat. It's an increase in poultry, and it's an increase in polyunsaturated fat because poultry is fed corn. So that's a really striking statistic. Other statistics that I think we should point out, just to look at the trends as we go into this data, are the same sort of things. Trends in plant versus animal foods. Since 1960, we're not eating more animal foods. We're eating way more plant foods, and yet we're getting much less healthy. Vegetable oil consumption, this is what we've been talking about. Basically none this is Crisco right here. 1920, 1940. Here is Ansel Keys. We should put Ansel Keys on the map right here. we can thank Ansel Keys for this increase in vegetable oil from 1950 to now. And you can look at the total and you can look at the types. The biggest one is soybean, but all of them are rising: corn, canola, sunflower, cottonseed, peanut, other. This is a staggering reality and very, very scary. So any thoughts on that? And maybe we can go into some of these studies, like how Ansel Keys got this crazy idea, how he supported it, and then what the studies actually show.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say on those graphs, which I've also published those, and it's quite striking. Like, I think it's actually, if you disaggregate the meat graph, I mean, you can actually see beef since 1970 consumption has declined by 35%, and red meat generally is down by 28%, and poultry is up by 128%. So those are very stark differences. And people say, well, you eat more meat. And we say, yeah, we're eating the meat that we're being told to eat, which is lean meat, which is chicken. We're eating a lot more chicken. So we really have. I think one of the things that I always point out when I use my version of those graphs is, in every single category that we've been told to eat more of, we eat more. We eat more grains, we eat more fruits, vegetables, we eat significantly more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, all of that we eat more of. There's not a single category where we've been told to increase consumption that we have not increased consumption since 1970. Likewise, there's not a single category where we've been told to decrease consumption that we have not decreased consumption. Butter's down, whole milk's down by 79%, butter's down, animal fat's down by 29%. We talked to red meat. I mean, everything. So that's not a cherry-picked information. There's not a single category of food where we have not complied. So Ansel Keys, again, so just we can bring it back to him to say, he was clearly, his ideas, which became institutionalized, and that's an important point. They were adopted by the American Heart Association, then adopted by the U.S. government. So when a hypothesis is institutionalized, it becomes very powerful, and people follow it. And so we've done as we've been told, and I think maybe what is particularly galling to some is that then people are sort of, these institutions turn around to the American public and say, well, you just haven't tried hard enough. You need to try harder because you haven't done enough. And it really is your fault. And that's sort of almost like a social justice side of angle, which is like, no, we have been in fact deceived by our authorities. And when I say deceived, I just mean they have made recommendations based on very weak and contradicted science. So what is that science in saturated fats, to get back to your question? When Ansel Keys came out with that recommendation and the American Heart Association endorsed it, it wasn't as if there were no scientists who disagreed or thought, let's go for it. It doesn't matter if we have no data. There really was almost no data at the time, except for the 7 country studies, which many people know about, but it was an epidemiological study, or it's also called an observational study. It shows association but not causation. And Ansel Keys had gone into it with a very strong bias, which he sort of pulled his way through in the end, concluding what he wanted to conclude. So that study has been talked about so much. I'm not sure we need to go into it in so much detail, but I think it's really important to say that many scientists in the start in the late 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s were very interested in this question of whether Ansel Keys was right. And so there were enormous by today's standards, large randomized controlled clinical trials on thousands, tens of thousands of people, costing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, conducted all over the world on this idea, do saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease? And we can talk about some of them. I mean, it's stunning to go through the history. In preparation for this podcast, I was rereading my book because I haven't really read it in a while, and it came out in 2014, but it's still a good place to go, I should say, if you want to read through some of these trials. And it's such a stunning story. Like, going back to the late 1950s, 1957. There's something called the Anti-Coronary Club trial that was directed by the director of the New York City Health Department, like Thomas Friedan today or recently. And oh, how nice. He started this study on 1,100 men, a huge study, and they had to reduce their meat consumption to, don't laugh, less than 4 times a week, which would, of course, be considered a huge amount of meat by today's standards. And they had to limit their eggs and dairy and eat more fish and poultry. And they had to have 2 tablespoons of those polyunsaturated fats every day. All together.
So they were taking actually tablespoons of vegetable oil.
Tablespoons of vegetable oils. And they found, and the other group, ate their regular diet. And what they found, and this is often found because, people's regular diets are often fairly unhealthy. In the beginning, they found that blood cholesterol, did go down, blood pressure went down in the group eating the reduced animal foods diet. But a decade into the trial, they had 26 deaths in this so-called diet club in the people who were eating more fish and poultry, and they had 0 deaths among the control. And at that point, Norman Jolliffe himself, the director of the New York City Health Department, he himself had died of a heart attack, so he was not around to explain these results. But clearly that was not a good outcome. But I mean, and this is just like a repeating meme throughout all these studies going on to the next decades, which is that nobody talks about it. Nobody discusses the failure. What they'll say is, well, they reduced their blood pressure, but they don't talk about the outcome, which is that more people died in this diet trial. So I mean, I can go on with these studies. They're incredible to read.
Let's talk about Minnesota because it's so striking. So the work of Christopher Ramsden, this guy is my freaking hero, Nina.
Well, so yeah, and then I want to also talk about the Mr. Fit study because people don't know about that one as much. The Minnesota Coronary Survey was a study funded by the National Institutes of Health that started in 1968. It was one of the largest ever tests of Ansel Keys' diet. The people in the regular group eating the regular diet had 38% fat and 18% saturated fat, which was considered normal at the time. 18%, just so you know, the cap currently is at 10%. And then the other group ate half that amount. This study went on for 4.5 years in 6 mental hospitals in Minnesota, and so they controlled all the food. It was
blinded. This was
it was blinded. It was blinded, so the people didn't know if they were on the control because they were in different institutions. So, and it was on 9,000 men and women. One of the only studies that included women. It's extraordinary, the size and the magnitude of this undertaking. And Ansel Keys was one of the primary investigators in this trial. At the end
but he's not on the paper.
But he's not on the final paper. So I want to say that the weakness of this study is that people went in and out of these hospitals. And so they did not have a constant controlled population. Although it was highly controlled in the foods they ate, it was not controlled in the steadiness of the population. And that was a flaw in the study. However, they did find significant differences between the diet and the control groups, meaning the diet had a significant impact in that they would meaningfully reduce their total blood cholesterol by 13%, which, by the way, was sort of the average that happened in all these studies, was a reduction in total blood cholesterol of about 13%. And yet, and this is also a consistent finding, no effect on cardiovascular events, meaning heart attacks, myocardial infarctions, or cardiovascular deaths, or total mortality. But what they did find is that the group on the vegetable oil diet, and this was another consistent finding in all these studies, the people eating the more vegetable oil died at higher rates from cancer. This was a very persistent finding throughout all these studies, and we could list off a bunch of them, but the vegetable oil diets consistently had higher rates of death from cancer. And if I could just say one more thing about that, that was such a disturbing finding that the National Institutes of Health had a series of very high-level meetings about it in the early 1980s, more than I even knew about when I wrote my book. There are 5 of them. And they discussed this at length, why the deaths from cancer. And ultimately, I spoke to the person who was the note taker and sort of the rapporteur of those all those meetings, and they said they couldn't explain it, and they decided that the importance of reducing cholesterol to prevent heart disease was more important than anything else, and if it resulted in more cancer, then that was just a side effect that they could live with.
And yet,
I mean,
if we look at
and now cancer is right up there with, heart disease is the number one cause of death in America. So, and the Minnesota Coronary Survey is also interesting for the reason that you alluded to, which is that in 2015, there was a follow-up paper. Oh, I should say the Minnesota Coronary Survey the findings came out, and remember, this is an NIH study. So, you're supposed to publish your results. They were not published for 16 years. 16 years. When they were published in a very sort of obscure journal that most nutrition scientists don't read, called ATVB. And Ansel Keys was not on the paper. Ivan France, who was on the paper, was another project investigator. He was asked by Gary Taubes, a journalist, why did you not publish the paper for 16 years? And he said, well, there was nothing wrong with it, our study, but we were just so disappointed in the way it came out.
Because I'll show,
just like we couldn't handle the results.
We couldn't handle the results. And then it was republished in 2015 by Christopher Ramsden, who also did something with the Sydney diet study that we'll talk about as well. But apparently, and you talk about this in the book, he had to go back into somebody's basement to look at the microfilms and find all this. There's like such a story of detective work. This is blatant evidence of them suppressing the data. Ansel Keys is not on the study because he couldn't stand to be, because it didn't show that his hypothesis worked. It proved his hypothesis wrong. And here's the study. It's over 9,000 people. It's blinded, meaning that if you talk about this in your book, that Keys and Stamler actually worked with the Swift Co. to make food that looked identical between the higher saturated fat and higher PUFA groups. They made hamburger patties, and they made butters and margarines that had all these things mixed. This is a blinded, randomized, controlled study. And it shows that replacement of saturated fat in the diet with linoleic acid lowers the serum cholesterol, but does not support the hypothesis that this translates to a lower risk of death from coronary heart disease or all cause. Findings from the Minnesota coronary experiment add to growing evidence that incomplete publication has contributed to overestimation of the benefits of replacing saturated fat with vegetable oils rich in linoleic acid. This is like this is a conspiracy.
Well, so, and what Christopher Ramsden found when he went into Ivan France's basement, which is France's son allowed Christopher Ramsden, an NIH researcher, to go and find the original magnetic tapes from the study. And they took the data off those tapes. And what they discovered is that when the paper had been published 16 years later, they still had not published all their findings. And Ramsden reported on those missing findings, which included the fact that the more the men lowered their cholesterol, the men, not the women, the more likely they were to die from a heart attack. So exactly the opposite of what they had hoped to find. So that was an added finding that had only been discovered by this detective work, which, as you say, was done much later on. But this larger story of that Ramsden writes about, of the non-publication of data, the not talking about studies, it's what's sort of called silent studies, or studies that are not discussed, studies that they come out and they just sort of, it's like shadow banning today. They're just like, they're not discussed. They fall out. They're not included in systematic reviews. They're not included in review papers. They just sort of disappear. And so the idea about saturated fats that saturated fats are bad for health was allowed to live on because any data to the contrary was simply not published or not spoken about. I spoke to this one researcher, Robert, I'm sure I mispronounced Knopp, who did 2 studies they're called the Seattle Boeing experiments. He did on Boeing employees in Seattle in the late 1990s, and he was testing low-fat diets. And what he discovered was that the more you lowered your fat in your diet, the more your risk of heart disease increased, because they continued to lower your HDL and increase your triglycerides often. And this effect was especially pronounced among women. He did 2 experiments, one on men and one on women. And when he said his studies came out, I interviewed him. He said they just dropped like a stone. He said nobody talked about them. Like they were never discussed. And it was, for him, I could feel his just shock and disappointment in the whole scientific community. He said, I thought that they would stir people to discussion, but he said, in fact, nobody wanted to talk about the studies and nobody wanted to talk to me. And that was also true of other researchers whom I spoke to. And it was it's largely because the American Heart Association, the US government is already recommending that people reduce their fat and saturated fat. And so these studies come out that contradict this already existing advice. It's no longer a level playing field where data is welcome. It's a situation where advice is already being dispensed to the American public. And so these contrary data are so discomforting that they just have to be ignored. And let's just say this paper that came out of the Journal of the American College of Cardiology that we just discussed earlier by these prominent scientists, those scientists discussed their data and their findings with the members, people who are involved in preparing the dietary guidelines in Washington. No, just as if they don't exist, as if the data doesn't exist, as if it's just like it doesn't exist. So it's still going on today, and it's truly astonishing to those of us who care about science and find it just just remarkable. I will say the other thing that prevents people from accepting this data is they're very married to this LDL hypothesis, which is why your podcasts on LDL are so important. But it's the fact that saturated fats tends to raise people's total LDL cholesterol is just this sticking point for some scientists. They just feel like LDL, like recently David Kessler, the former FDA commissioner, he said LDL is a toxic molecule. And this is, of course, based on this pharmaceutical model of the biggest blockbuster drug to ever hit the pharmaceutical industry, which is statins. So there's this huge financial investment in LDL, but nutrition scientists buy into this as well. And so the fact that saturated fats raises your LDL is just this, it's just something that can't get past, even though saturated fats has no effect on the thing you care about, which is the heart attacks and death. It's like, I always say, it's like you're judging people like that, like the half point in a marathon, and you're like, it doesn't, but what you care about is your time at the end. Well, the LDL is just a little thing along the way.
And again, I think that's why I've done, seriously, you guys, if you haven't heard, I've done 6 podcasts on LDL. Like, I've talked to preeminent people. I mean, there's 10 to 12 hours of podcasts on this. There's a 35-page chapter in my book with 60 references about this. LDL, for anyone to claim that LDL, low-density lipoprotein, is atherogenic in and of itself is ludicrous. There are genetic conditions which lead to very low LDL, and that's called Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome. And those children have congenital deformities and they suffer severe infections. And the way we combat those severe infections is to give them back cholesterol so they can get LDL. LDL is a vital immunologic molecule in the human body, and anyone that ignores that, anyone that sees LDL as sinister, is completely disconnected. Why would nature have designed a molecule in our body that moves cholesterol backbone around, which is used to make all of your sex hormones and all of the cell membranes in your human body, and has an immunologic role? Why would that be killing us? It makes no sense. The story is much more complex, and people cannot get over the fact that saturated fat raises LDL. And as you said, Nina, in many of these studies, they'll say, look, PUFAs, polyunsaturated vegetable oils, it lowered my LDL, therefore it's good. I did a video on Instagram this morning and someone commented, I switched to chicken and fish and lowered my LDL. Isn't that good? No, that's not good. And I will show you why, because this is what is happening and no one will talk to you about it. Lowering LDL is not the metric that we should use. You can give someone, this is an interventional study published in Arteriosclerosis, Thrombosis, and Vascular Biology. This is not a fringe journal. They gave people less saturated fat and more polyunsaturated fat. It's a small experiment that's like a lot of these studies, but since it was published in 2004, they could look at two other things that no one is looking at: oxidized LDL and lipoprotein little a. What did they find? As you decrease saturated fat and add polyunsaturated fat, your LDL goes down. But the amount of oxidized LDL and the amount of lipoprotein little a goes up. And that is why people are not getting better. That is why people continue to die. And that is why people are having massive problems. PUFAs, polyunsaturated fats, will cause your LDL to oxidize more. What's a better predictor of heart disease? Oxidized LDL. It's a much more complicated equation. So this person on Instagram is saying, hey, I lowered my LDL with chicken and fish. Yeah, but your oxidized LDL went up, and nobody's going to test that. And everybody is thinking that lowering your LDL is a good thing. And in these studies, we consistently see a 13% lowering of LDL, but no one is checking oxidized LDL, and no one is checking insulin resistance markers. Dollars to donuts. That's probably not a great saying for this podcast, but I'm willing to place a bet. I will bet 3 ribeyes from Bel Campo on the fact that in any of these studies where you reduce LDL by increasing polyunsaturated fatty acids, you are going to become more insulin resistant. And that, my friends, is the pathway to a quick grave and demise. And that is my hypothesis for why the cancers are going up in this. But you mentioned, I want to show something else because this is in your book and I think it's amazing. And then we can move on to the Mr. Fit study, because that one actually shows this relationship between these things and cancer. But here you go, guys. Take this ad to your doctor. 1976, Mazola, pure corn oil, cholesterol lowering diet. Like, this is still petrified, ingrained, fossilized in the consciousness of the majority of the doctors in this country. And it is because we are not changing the paradigm, and people are so bent on lowering your cholesterol. But let's talk about, you want to talk about the Mr. Fit study? Because this is a fascinating
I mean, sure. It's, like there, I just, want to go back to the overview here, like of what we're talking about is that there were large government-funded randomized controlled clinical trials, the gold standard of science in countries all over the world, testing diets low in saturated fat and cholesterol. And really, in Finland and in Australia and in the UK and many in the US, and they just could not find what they had wanted to find. And so I'll just, many people have heard of the Minnesota coronary survey but most people haven't heard about this one. It was kind of interesting to go back and read. It's called the Mr. Fit trial. It was started in 1973, and it was directed by Jeremiah Stamler, who was kind of Ansel Keys' right-hand man. He's a cardiologist in Chicago. He was very close to the American Heart Association for most of his life. And it was on 12,000 men who were identified as being high risk because they had high cholesterol, they were mostly obese and had high blood pressure. He got them in the intervention group. This is just so extraordinary. It just boggles the mind to read this. He was quite successful in getting them to quit smoking. They took medicine for their blood pressure, and they were given a low-fat, low-saturated fat diet.
3 interventions.
Right. This went on for 7 years that they did this study. So it was an intervention study for 7 years with a 16-year follow-up. And at the end of that, it was even though he had gotten the intervention group, he got 21% of them he had successfully gotten them to quit smoking, compared to only, I think, 7% in the other group. More people died in the diet group than in the control group. So these are people who've quit smoking, taking blood pressure for a lower, blood pressure medication, and they're on this diet, and more of them died at the end of the study. And they suffered more lung cancer, even though they had given up smoking. So these are such contrary results. And I did actually have the opportunity to talk to Dr. Stamler about this study. And his response was that, I don't know, unexplained, unpredictable. We don't understand it. We couldn't explain it. It was just a blip. We couldn't get it. I mean, just imagine, he's devoted 7 years of his life to this, and he's lived through all these other studies, none of which had the results that they expected. And still, he's fervently believes that this hypothesis is correct. He is also somebody who takes 6 spoonfuls of vegetable oils every day. So, and in other studies, there was the Sydney Heart study, which you mentioned, which included 458 men, and they replaced saturated fats with sunflower oil. Wow, you're so efficient with your slides there.
I try.
It's very good. I'm impressed. It went on for more than 3 years. And they found that they actually stopped the study, I think, because the cardiovascular events increased in the group on the safflower oil diet. I mean, and what? Again, it's like that study was ignored, not included in, this is the reanalysis of it by Christopher Ramsden. The original study was I forget the year it was published, but in any case, I mean, this is incredible. There's the Helsinki businessman study. There's the Oslo study. There's the, there's the LA veteran study. There were just enough. It's fair to say, let me just pause for a moment and say, it's fair to say the diet heart hypothesis, as proposed by Ansel Keys, is the most tested hypothesis in the history of nutrition science. And it has not been able to be confirmed.
It's failed.
So at that point, you have to say, like, let's invest our time and money elsewhere. And, it really, let it go. They also did these studies in children. Amazing. There was one really main study called the DISC study, which was in children with abnormally high LDL, which means they were likely to have some kind of genetic condition. And they put children on a low-fat, low-saturated fat diet, and maybe 400 children, 300 to 400 children. And those children suffered, it didn't harm them, it doesn't seem, but the children all suffered from nutritional deficiencies. They were all deficient in multiple nutrients. And that's because if you limit saturated fats, you're limiting the foods. This is a critical point. In the recent Dietary Guideline Committee meeting, somebody said, your body has no essential need for saturated fats, so why don't we just reduce the amount that we should eat down to 0? And then, really, that was a suggestion. Well, why not 0? And the answer is the foods containing saturated fats are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet, and with the nutrients that are most bioavailable to humans. So you cannot get the iron, zinc, choline, potassium, and magnesium that you need unless you're eating those foods.
K2, B12, anserine, taurine, creatine.
Yeah. So as a result, actually, this is an astonishing thing, that the government diet that is fed to our school children, our elderly, in our hospitals, and to our military, that diet is does not meet nutritional adequacy goals. It doesn't meet them. It falls short. And if it weren't, that's just coming back to why would they recommend refined grains? They recommend refined grains every day because those refined grains are enriched and fortified in B vitamins and especially B12. And you can't get, and if they didn't recommend and include refined grains, then people would be even more nutritionally deficient, suffer more nutritional inadequacy. So, it's, I like the reason I started this group called the Nutrition Coalition to try to change dietary guidelines, which may be a fool's task and impossible to do because we're really up against major industries. But it's because your listeners, people like me, we can control what we eat. We are not subject to the failed policy of the government. But, people on Native American reservations, poor school children, the most disadvantaged people among us, people in nursing homes, people in there are people who cannot make their choices. They can only eat the food that they're given. So, we have guidelines that are disadvantaging the most disadvantaged among us, and we can't afford to have a population that's sick and unhealthy. Like, it's terrible for them, and it's terrible for all of us because we all pay for it in the end.
Not when coronavirus happens, not when the next pandemic happens, and as you said, we have followed the guidelines. In general, people eat less red meat, less saturated fat, more fruits and vegetables, more grains. We're doing what we're being told to do. It's part of the consciousness. If the guidelines change, people would change the way they eat. They would probably riot in the streets because they've been misled for so long. But This is very powerful.
Absolutely.
And like you said, it affects everyone. It affects your kids. It affects all of our families and all of these institutionalized people. It's crazy. You in the hospital, I'm doing my residency. You can't give someone saturated fat in the hospital. They're fed canola oil. They're given margarine in the hospital. They're given, we are giving people polyunsaturated fats in the hospital. It's just like, this is the problem, right? I did a podcast with Asim Malhotra, who is a cardiologist in Britain. And he said he's just put a stent in somebody and they served him a plate with a hamburger, French fries, and a milkshake. And he looks at the nurse and goes, what the heck? And I asked him in the podcast, well, what's the worst part of that? And he said, well, the hamburger is definitely the best part. That's the only part I wanted him to eat. But the bread and the mayonnaise and the French fries, which are certainly cooked in vegetable oil because no one cooks French fries in lard anymore, those are all, and the milkshake, like those are all okay. It's like, what the heck are we doing? And this is because it meets the guidelines. And as you're saying, there are actual places, there are actual medical institutions that are saying you can't teach outside of the nutritional guidelines. You can't tell someone to do a low carb diet. That's not in the guidelines. Although thankfully, the American Diabetes Association has now acknowledged that a low carbohydrate diet can be efficacious. But there are many places in which a dietitian cannot teach guidelines that are outside of what the US government recommends. So it's like a muzzle. It's totally limiting what we can teach people. And if it's all based on garbage science, how come the story isn't being told? It's crazy. I just want to show Sydney again real quick and then a few others so that people I just really want to make this very clear. Like you said, this is Chris Ramsden's reanalysis. The intervention group, which is the group that had less saturated fat and more omega-6 linoleic acid from safflower oil, had higher rates of death than controls. In cardiovascular disease, all-cause mortality, coronary heart disease. What? Like, this is a more evaluation of recovered data. Chris Ramsden did it again, man. This guy is like my freaking hero. Like, he found recovered data that was never published from a trial conducted from 1966 to 1973. This is a shadow banned trial, just like Minnesota. And it showed the exact same thing. Ansel Keys was wrong. And no one is willing to admit this. Here's Helsinki. We've got the Helsinki businessman's trial. Basically showed the same thing. Increased PUFA, decreased saturated fat, people die. People definitely don't get better, and they get, conversely, a clustering of low risk factors predicted low total coronary and cancer mortality. The traditional risk factors, smoking, blood pressure, and cholesterol, are significantly associated with 28-year mortality in this high school class populations. And then what they're saying is that in the group that had more saturated fat and less PUFA, they did better. The study completely went the other way. There's one more that I think that we should just mention because I like to share as many as I can with my audience. And I know you were super excited about this one. Do you just want to say a few words about the Indian Railroad study?
Oh yeah, so this is an observation study. It's not an intervention study, but I think it may have been. This one was really unknown, maybe until my book, or I'm not sure if it was mentioned before, but it was a study of railroad sweepers in India, and it was on 1 million men. And it compared it measured the diet, and it looked at the rates of cardiovascular disease at men in the north and men in the south, and it found that the men they had the rates of cardiovascular disease and death were 7 times higher in the southern part of India, that's called an area called Madras, compared to the Punjab in the north. And when they analyzed the diet, this was done in the 1960s, they found that those in the north, again, 1/7 the amount of heart disease, were eating 8 to 19 times more fat than their southern counterparts. And it was mostly dairy that they ate. They ate tons of dairy. And in the south, they were eating very little fat, and most of it was of groundnut oil, which is what we would call nut oil, is vegetable oil. So we call it vegetable oil or plant oil. So and the recommendations, which this is already, the mid 1960s, so already they feel like they're a little sheepish in their recommendations because they feel like they're going against what the Americans are saying, but they sort of humbly say, it is our modest recommendation that people, in order to avoid heart disease, they should have more foods of dairy origin. But they're very tentative about it because and this is true in all these papers, where there's this sort of statement of, we know that this is what everybody thinks, but we didn't find it in this kind of little small, meek way above their paper. But we're sure the hypothesis is right if only more tests were done. There must be something wrong with us for not finding this. So it's really, really stunning, that study. I mean, 1 million men, and the numbers are just so dramatic. It's really hard to ignore.
It's so dramatic.
And actually, there's a kind of modern day counterpoint to that. The PURE study, which is being run by a group in Canada, which is the largest ever observational study ever done, including, I think, data from 28 countries. So all over the world, they're collecting data, and they're doing it with consistent methods, which makes the data comparable, which is something that we've never had before. And they're finding, their strong finding was that saturated fat was inversely related to particularly stroke, so that the more saturated fat you ate, the more you were protected from stroke, the higher rate you ate, the higher rates of stroke. And that otherwise saturated fat did not have a negative effect on heart disease at all. So, but I mean, if I could tell you, we've talked about the clinical trials because that's the more rigorous data. But if you wanted to talk about the very long list of observational studies that have all been done and forgotten, where they could not show that saturated fat was associated with higher rates of heart disease, we could be here all night. I mean, there was a long list of those kinds of studies that were done, and they just continue to be disregarded. And to be fair, now that we have clinical trials, that is the more rigorous data.
And that's what we should really be looking at. I agree completely. I just think it's such a striking study and just worth pointing out to people.
It is. Yeah. And I think that
because it's such a big study.
Yeah. And I want to say, as a more general point about, the sort of the value of different kinds of science, I mean, observational studies are most strongly used when they, as a point of contradiction to a hypothesis. So something can be associated with something else, like internet usage and cancer, but it doesn't mean that one causes the other. Unless it's a very, very strong association. But when something is strongly not associated with something, like using umbrellas in rain, where you're pretty sure those things don't go together. So it's in this contradictory way that we can use observational data.
And observational data always must be tested with interventional data. That's just the way it has to happen. And that doesn't always happen, right? I mean, it's just crazy that we're making so many generalizations now. And this is really a point that I make over and over in my discussions, is that so many things that are told to us today, red meat causes cancer, or red meat is associated with higher rates of cancer, or associated with higher rates of heart disease. They're all observational studies that need to be tested with intervention. And when we do the interventions, we see, just like we see with these saturated fat studies, red meat doesn't cause any problems because it's a food that humans have been eating forever. But the media loves observational epidemiology, and it's so misleading. So I want to just pivot for a moment as we wrap up here. I know, do you have a few more minutes to hang out?
Sure.
Okay. And I want to talk about a statement that you made. This is a great jumping off point. In the nutritional guidelines, somebody said, saturated fat is not required in the human diet. I want to talk about why that statement is misleading and potentially very, very wrong. So in our body, there is something called de novo lipogenesis, whereby our body makes fat, but our body makes saturated fat. So this, again, just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense from the Ansel Keys perspective. Your body, my body, every single body makes palmitic acid in the body. We make stearic acid. Well, I don't know if we make stearic, but we make a 18-chain, palmitic acid in the human body. That is de novo lipogenesis. We make this. Why would our bodies make something that is so bad for us? And then our bodies have an enzyme, which is called SCD1, steroyl-CoA desaturase. It's a delta 9 desaturase, and I'll talk about why that enzyme is so important, that turns that saturated fatty acid, that turns that palmitic acid to palmitoleic acid. It turns into a monounsaturated fatty acid. And that ratio between palmitic and palmitoleic acid is very, very important. And this is where PUFAs come into play. The human body does not make polyunsaturated fatty acids, ever. We don't make it. So all of the polyunsaturated fatty acids in our body are from our diet, and this is what's so concerning to me about polyunsaturated vegetable oil, is that essentially we are a gas tank, and all of our body will store the oils that we eat. So if you drink corn oil, or you are taking 2 tablespoons or 4 tablespoons of corn oil every day in your diet, you are storing that corn oil in your cells. And that corn oil, that polyunsaturated PUFA is eventually going to get oxidized in a process called beta oxidation. But remember, that is linoleic acid, which looks very different than stearic or palmitic acid because it is a polyunsaturated fatty acid. Oleic acid and palmitoleic acid are monounsaturated fatty acids. So the way they go through beta oxidation is very importantly different. But this is the point that I made earlier, that evolutionarily, humans have only ever seen very, very low amounts of polyunsaturated fatty acids in our diet because wild animals don't have polyunsaturated fatty acids to the level that domesticated animals do. I want to share this because I think it's super fascinating. The fatty acid content in chicken thigh and breast as affected by dietary polyunsaturation level. Basically, this study says that if you feed a chicken corn, it will have way more polyunsaturated fatty acid in its diet, in its body, than a wild bird. Okay, so basically, chickens fed corn are like a synthetic or a sneaky source of vegetable oil. So people might be listening to this and thinking, I don't drink vegetable oil, but if you're eating mainstream chicken that's fed corn, you are getting linoleic acid in this way. And I'll tell you why this is a big deal in a moment. The other thing I want to highlight here is that we see the same thing in pork. The fatty acid content from pork is the same thing. The effect of dietary mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids on the fatty acid composition of pigs' adipose tissues. The takeaway here is that if you feed a pig corn or you feed a pig soybeans, their fat is going to be very PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acid enriched. And again, if we are eating animal foods that have higher concentrations of polyunsaturated fatty acids than our human biology is expecting, things go awry very, very badly. And this is why. Because humans don't make polyunsaturated fatty acids. And because of the way that beta oxidation of these polyunsaturated fatty acids happens, it can affect the insulin sensitivity of the adipocyte. You guys better buckle up because this is about to get a little bit crazy, I'm telling you. I did an Instagram on this on Saturday morning. So if you want to rewatch it, you can rewatch that as well. But I want us to talk about this as a really interesting theory. And this is why saturated fatty acids are absolutely invaluable to human health. So check this out. If you guys have seen beta oxidation, this is the process of breaking down long-chain fatty acids into short-chain fatty acids to be used for energy within your mitochondria. The takeaway from this is that as a fatty acid is broken down in beta oxidation, FADH2 and NADH2 are produced. But the very important piece here is that when you break down polyunsaturated fatty acids or monounsaturated fatty acids, they have a different ratio of FADH2 to NADH2. Paul, why are you telling us all this? Because that ratio of FADH2 to NADH2 determines whether your adipocyte is going to be insulin sensitive or insulin resistant. And this is where things get a little complicated. So bear with me here, you guys. You want your fat cells, so this is the fat cells in your belly. You want your fat cells to be insulin resistant because when insulin binds to the surface of an adipocyte, that is going to trigger, if that fat cell is insulin sensitive, that fat cell will take up glucose and will take up lipids via lipoprotein lipase, and that fat cell will grow. You want your fat cells to be insulin resistant. And the way you get fat cells that are insulin resistant is by eating saturated fat. And this has been shown time and time again, that if you increase the amount of palmitic acid and stearic acid in the diet, your fat cells become insulin resistant, which means that when insulin spikes with a meal and insulin signals to those adipocytes to grow, they won't respond. Those adipocytes won't take up glucose and they won't take up lipids and become bigger fat cells. What I am saying here, guys, is that suet from animals is a fat burner. Suet from animals is a fire starter. If you eat a diet that is higher in stearic acid and palmitic acid, you will lose weight because it is telling your fat cells to be insulin resistant. You don't want your fat cells to be insulin sensitive. Now, because, and this is where things get a little bit shaky, so bear with me, because of the different structure of the polyunsaturated fatty acids in beta oxidation and that changing ratio of FADH2 to NADH2, your fat cells become insulin sensitive when you eat polyunsaturated fatty acids. It breaks your metabolism. And insulin sensitive fat cells equal fat cells that are growing and getting bigger. And fat cells that are getting bigger means fat people. So if you want to get fat, eat polyunsaturated fatty acids because they have a unique signal to your abdominal adipocytes to make them more insulin sensitive. Now, I'll finish the story here. As the fat cell expands, right, it sends out free fatty acids to the rest of the body. And the signals from that fat cell are called lipokines. I'm going to do a whole podcast about this in the future, you guys. As your fat cells grow, they send out free fatty acids to the rest of the body. And those free fatty acids from the fat cells tell the rest of the body whether it should be insulin sensitive or insulin resistant. And those free fatty acids are what determine what is going on. All right, so I'm going to pause it right there. Nina's got to go. I'm going to say goodbye to Nina and hear about what she's doing that's radical. And then I'm going to finish that little theory about why saturated fatty acids are so important. But Nina, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, talking about this amazing book. I think everyone should read this because it's such a great history of this. And I so appreciate you reviewing all these studies with me and sharing the history of all this. The last question I always ask people is, what is the most radical thing that you have done recently?
Oh, well, stayed home without seeing anyone for 3 months. Is that not the most radical thing that any of us has ever done, really?
Radical, but maybe not in the way that we hope.
Cataclysmic event in all of modern history is what we all just experienced. So, yeah, that would, I can't really think of anything more radical than that.
Yeah. Well, where can people find more of your work? How can they support what you're doing?
So yeah, my page is ninateichholz.com, which is just my name. But I think that the most interesting place to go right now, if you're interested in the dietary guidelines, is nutritioncoalition.us, and it's nutritioncoalition, one word, .us. And please go learn. If it's so important right now because we're at a kind of critical moment where the expert report is coming out, and we are really urging people to call or write their members of Congress and weigh in, and to say we really need, it's so important to have guidelines that are helpful for people. And just remember, for all of us who have choice, we are lucky and we are fortunate, but there are so many people who rely on these programs and are forced into eating this food. And so we really desperately need evidence-based guidelines. So I urge you to do that. Even if you're not a normally politically active person like me, I think it's just important that members of Congress hear this. They do not normally hear from people like your listeners. So I think I would really urge people to do that. There's another group called lowcarbaction.org, which is specifically advocating for the inclusion of a low carb dietary pattern in the diet, in the guidelines. So that's another group you can go to. But they're both, I think they're both doing really important work. And I think there's just a huge change that's happened in people understanding about food and health and how to improve their health. And this has all happened in maybe just 5 years' time. And so it really is a revolution. When you say what's the most radical thing that I've done, what is the most radical thing that has happened is the last 5 years of nutrition and health. And we just need to bring this to the rest of the country so other people can have the same knowledge. That's really it. So other people can unlearn the lies and learn the truth about how to be healthy.
I love that. That's what I'm all about. And that's really one of the huge reasons I do what I do, is that there's so many lies that we're trying to help people unlearn. That's
Right.
what's so radical about what we're doing. So thank you so much for your work, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It is so great to talk to you.
All right. I'll
Thanks.
talk to you
All right.
soon.
Take care.
All right, you guys. Nina had to go, but this idea around stearic acid is so interesting to me, and it speaks so clearly to just the very critical nature of saturated fat in our diet that I want to talk about it. So to summarize what I was just talking about, this is detailed. I talk about it on my Instagram. I'm going to do a whole podcast on this. In summary, linoleic acid is so toxic to humans because it breaks the sensitivity for insulin at the level of your fat cells. Your fat cells control the insulin sensitivity of the rest of your body by free fatty acids. We know this very clearly. There are some very interesting studies that have been done on people with a familial lipodystrophy called Dunnington lipodystrophy. And what this is a gene that is involved called laminin. But the gene is not as important as what we see. In these people, we see this is a one gene mutation, and they get premature atherosclerosis. And they have what is called familial partial lipodystrophy. And what happens is that because they cannot store fat, their free fatty acids go way up in their blood because they are always releasing fat into their blood. And so it's pretty darn clear that people with this mutation and excess free fatty acids in the blood lead to insulin resistance. And the first paper was about atherosclerosis, which was very premature. This one is about elevated C-reactive protein and free fatty acids among non-diabetic carriers of this partial lipodystrophy. So what's going on here is that you get one gene mutated, this laminin gene in these people, and what do you see? You see basically they look skinny, but they have huge amounts of visceral adipose tissue, which is spewing out free fatty acids. Okay, and that free fatty acid leak into the human body, and it's a ratio of palmitoleic and palmitic acid, is triggering insulin resistance in those people in a massive way. And this is not what we're dealing with everyone, but it gives us significant insights into what's going on here. That the adipocytes control insulin resistance of the rest of the body. If your fat cells are insulin resistant, they will not take up glucose, they will not take up fats, they will not grow. If they don't grow, then they won't release free fatty acids. So the theory is this: when you eat saturated fat, when you eat stearic acid or palmitic acid, because of the way that is beta oxidized in the mitochondria, the FADH2 to NADH2 ratio makes the cells of your adipocytes, makes your adipocytes insulin resistant, meaning they don't get bigger, meaning that the signal from your diet, both for satiety at the level of the hypothalamus and in your fat cells, is to become insulin resistant, meaning to not grow when you eat saturated fat. So stearic acid and palmitic acid in suet are extremely valuable to get insulin-resistant fat cells, which won't grow. But if you eat polyunsaturated vegetable oils, your fat cells get a different signal. They remain insulin sensitive, they get broken, and they get bigger. But as they get bigger, they start to leak free fatty acids. And that free fatty acid leak from those expanding adipocytes that are insulin sensitive when they shouldn't be because you're eating too much linoleic acid makes the rest of your body insulin resistant. So it's a balance, right? The fat cells in the abdominal adipose cells and the rest of the body are inverse. If you have insulin-resistant adipose cells, you will have an insulin-sensitive body. If you have insulin-sensitive adipocytes in your belly, you will have an insulin-resistant body. And what determines the insulin state, the insulin-resistant state of the adipocytes? The fats that you eat. The stearic acid and the palmitic acid that have been vilified for years are actually the way to get thin, because they will trigger satiety in the hypothalamus. They will trigger those abdominal adipose cells to become insulin resistant, and the rest of your body will be insulin sensitive. It's probably a little complex. I want to talk about something else which makes it perhaps a little bit more clear. In your fat cells, in the podcast with Nina, what I talked about was that in the human body with de novo lipogenesis, we make saturated fatty acids, we make palmitic acid. And then we turn palmitic acid into palmitoleic acid with an enzyme called stearoyl-CoA desaturase. This enzyme right here turns palmitic acid into palmitoleic acid, all right? That is a desaturase that is adding a short chain, that is adding a double bond, making a saturated fatty acid into a monounsaturated fatty acid. This is very important. Why? Because the balance of your saturated to monounsaturated fats in your fat cells is a key indicator of insulin sensitivity. And one of the things that we can see in multiple mouse models and many experiments is that if you inhibit SCD1 in mice, they will not become fat. So you can lose this enzyme, stearoyl-CoA desaturase 1 function, protects mice against adiposity, loss of that function. So if you inhibit this enzyme, and these mice cannot convert palmitic acid to palmitoleic acid in the adipose tissue, their adipose tissue remains insulin resistant, and they do not develop adiposity. Furthermore, there is a critical role for SCD1 in the onset of diet-induced hepatic insulin resistance, meaning that you can inhibit the function of SCD1 and the mice will not become insulin resistant. Because if you inhibit the function of SCD1, they will not be able to make more of this palmitoleic acid in the fat cells, and the fat cells will not leak the free fatty acids. They will not signal to the rest of the body to become insulin resistant. What does this have to do with anything? If you are eating polyunsaturated fatty acids, you are going to be breaking this SCD1 mechanism. And in general, we have to think about things that are going to push this SCD1 enzyme over the edge, making more of this palmitoleic acid versus palmitate in your fat cells and leading to systemic insulin resistance. But this is one of the key mechanisms by which insulin resistance develops in the periphery. It is extra leak of free fatty acids from your adipocytes because of ingestion of polyunsaturated vegetable oils. Yet another reason why these oils are so toxic. And what I was so interested in really bent on sharing is that chicken and pork that are fed with corn are going to have way more linoleic acid in them than they should. And this is going to contribute to insulin resistance and adiposity. This is what's so important about a carnivore diet and having red meat in your diet. And why red meat is so important, because ruminants, even if they're fed with corn, though we know regenerative agriculture is the way to go, ruminants fed with corn can turn those polyunsaturated fatty acids back into saturated fatty acids, and they don't accumulate the same high levels of polyunsaturated fatty acids that monogastric animals like pigs and chickens do. So be very careful with your turkey, your chicken, and your pork if it's fed corn, which most of it is, and your eggs, soy and corn-free eggs. So anyway, that is a huge rabbit hole having to do with the reactive oxygen species theory of insulin resistance. Hat tip to Brad Marshall and Peter from Hyperlipid. I'm really building and bridging on many of their research findings with this stuff, but it was something that I'm so interested in with regard to saturated fat that I had to share it at the end of this podcast. And I think it really drives home the point that saturated fat is absolutely essential in the human diet. And here's the kicker. If you have been filling your body with vegetable oils your whole life, you should be emphasizing stearic acid and palmitic acid in suet now to get rid of those while you get rid of them. Because that vegetable oil is stored in your fat cells and it is going to break your metabolism moving forward. Last thing, why does a low-carb diet work? Because in order for this process to happen, whereby your fat cells expand, there has to be an insulin signal at the fat cell to tell the fat cell to expand. But a low-carb diet works in the short term because that insulin goes so low. So there's two things going on here, right? The fat cell signaling can be broken by the vegetable oils. And in the setting of a fat cell signaling, which is broken by vegetable oils, if your insulin is high because you're eating carbohydrates, that fat cell is going to expand. But if you decrease your insulin by doing a low carbohydrate diet, you will take away the stimulus to the fat cell to grow. which fixes it in the short term. But if you listen to my CGM podcast with the folks from NutriSense, you will know that you don't want to have zero insulin signaling all the time. You want some insulin signaling. And this is why people who may benefit from low carb diets in the short term get fat when they add carbs back, because their fat cells are still broken if they are not changing the type of fat they are eating. There is nothing more important, in my opinion, than the fats that you are eating, and that what you are eating, it's what you are eating that is eating that is critical. So we want to have lots of saturated fat in our diet, stearic acid and palmitic acid, to make your fat cells not grow, and you will remain insulin sensitive. You can use a low carb diet in the short term to lower the insulin as well, but it's not going to fix things in the long term. The long-term fix is at the level of the fat cell, which is broken because of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So I'll do much more on this. I'm super geeked about it, as you can tell. Check out my book, thecarnivorecodebook.com. Check out Nina's stuff. She had to run. I had to do a monologue at the end of this podcast. They're always 2 hours because there's always so much good stuff to talk about. Hope you guys are doing good. And let me know what you think of this one. I'm going to wrap it up here. And that's it. I'm about to go hiking. That's what I'm going to do to stay radical. All right, you guys. I hope you enjoyed that one. I really appreciate Nina, and I was really happy to be able to share many of these studies. Isn't it just striking the way that shadow banning has existed for 60 years? Imagine that. The Minnesota coronary study, the Sydney heart study, these studies were never talked about until 2015, 2012, 2013, but they pretty darn clearly show as interventional trials that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat makes people die more of cancer and of heart disease. Not a good thing. And yet mainstream awareness is that saturated fat is still bad for humans because everyone is so LDL centric, and it drives me bonkers. I talk about that in my book, and I try to break these untruths. That's what we're doing, is just to really shed light on this. And of course, I'm going to be wrong from time to time, but there's a lot of evidence here. I don't think I'm wrong about this. Pretty sure LDL context matters. You don't want to be insulin resistant. And that's what I talk about at the end of the podcast. So hopefully that made sense. I don't think I did the best job explaining it, but I'm going to be talking about a whole lot more. Do a whole episode with Brad Marshall and talk about stearic acid, palmitic acid, long chain fatty acids, and why they seem to make our fat cells insulin resistant, which is what we want, because then those fat cells signal to the rest of the body that they can be insulin sensitive. There's a differential sort of pairing there, that when the fat cells are insulin resistant, the body becomes insulin sensitive and vice versa. And how do you make your fat cells insulin sensitive, leading to insulin resistance in the rest of the body? Well, one way is by eating too much polyunsaturated fatty acids, because it sort of creates more of a signal in the mitochondria of the fat cells that they should be insulin sensitive. And then when the fat cells are insulin sensitive, they grow, they release free fatty acids to the rest of the body, which we know constitutively creates insulin resistance. That's the familial Dunnigan lipodystrophy stuff. Anyway, complicated stuff, super interesting, but wanted to talk about it. I am loving Austin. I've been playing in lakes and rivers and just digging it. And so I'm so stoked about it. The one thing I forgot to talk about at the beginning of the podcast was that we are doing a meetup. We are doing a meetup at Terry Black's in Austin on June the 28th. I believe it's a Sunday at noon. So do not miss that if you are in Austin. And if not, please be with us in spirit. Please check out whiteoakpastures.com. Use CarnivoreMD for 10% off. Check out nutrisense.io. Let them know I sent you. Get a CGM, even if it's for 2 weeks. Save the records. Let me know what you think. Maybe I'll get your records on my CGM podcast. You want to send them to me? I'll take a look. It's hard to get back to everybody, but maybe I'll consider it and talk about it on the podcast. But you will learn so much, and I think it's a good thing, and I'm so excited that my dad is going to do it too. And check out my book, thecarnivorecodebook.com. Please support my podcast by leaving me a review there. Leave me a review for my book on Amazon, and get my newsletter at carnivoremd.com. I love you all. Stay radical. Share this podcast widely, because look, I know that you know someone who believes saturated fat is bad for them, and that just might be killing them. So anyway, onward to the tipping point, as one of my friends who emailed me like to say, and stay radical, and I will talk to you guys soon.